Hi, this is Axel from dreamsanctuary.net. To start this video, I would like to recommend two articles I've published recently. The first article is called First Dream as Destiny. It talks about the idea that the earliest dream that one can remember is an anticipation of one's destiny. Destiny here is not to be understood as something consciously intended, but rather a kind of automatic or purposive orientation for the first parts of one's life. I developed this idea by going into Jung's first dream and mine. I hope this article encourages you to think about your own first dream and what it could mean. In the second article, I present internal family systems as a practical way to deal with complexes. I outline the main features of that therapeutic model and suggest some resources. Notably, there is a very useful guided meditation by Richard Schwartz, the creator of internal family systems. Try it and see if it works for you. It sure helped me. Next, I have been reading the biography C.G. Jung, His Myth in Our Time by Marie-Lousie von Franz. It's a fairly difficult read, as she assumes that the reader is familiar with the whole of Jung's writings, but there is a lot of great insights. For instance, there is a chapter on dreams, and I've selected two quotes that I wanted to share. For Jung, however, the dream contains much more than uncovering repressed, generally infantile unconscious wishes. It alludes in symbolic form to the goal toward which the psychic energy gradient is striving. That is, the dream contains anticipatory symbolization of developmental tendencies. That is why the direction in which the therapy is to proceed must be derived from the analysant's own dreams. That is finally the reason why, in Jungian therapy, there can be no technique or method and no arbitrary therapeutic goal to which the doctor aspires. It is a question rather of seeking to understand the specific energy trends towards healing and growth in each individual patient in order to strengthen them through participation by consciousness and to assist their breakthrough into the conscious life of the patient. Our ego consciousness tends to concentrate exclusively on adaptation to the circumstances of the present. It therefore obscures or neglects unconscious material that is not appropriate to adaptation, or else the unconscious contents have too low an energy charge to become conscious, or perhaps are not yet ready to become conscious. Through this concentration, the ego can easily develop a one-sidedness which does not accord with instinctive totality. It is the transcendent function, that is, the symbol-forming spirit, which makes organically possible the transition from a one-sided attitude to a new, more complete one. By symbolically sketching new possibilities of life, it opens up the way for growth. The dream never points exclusively to something known, but always to complex data not yet grasped by our ego consciousness. It points to a meaning we have not yet consciously realized. So why am I quoting these? It's important to know that, compared to the ego or even a skilled therapist, the unconscious has a more comprehensive view of the person. In this respect, dreams sketch future development while taking into account the whole of the person, what von Franz refers here as the instinctive totality. Another way to say this is stating that the psyche has the ability to bring the multiplicity of instinctual drives into a unified structure. So if we understand dreams as this unified structure of natural adaptative development, we can observe that the dream brings forward elements that are starting to become present in the personality. These elements need to be worked with upfront so that their integration will be easier. In Memories, Dreams, Reflection, Jung writes that it's man's task to become conscious of the contents that press upwards from the unconscious. In fact, if these elements are denied attention, they will start to appear outside as resistances, acts by tricksters, fait accompli, diseases, fateful accidents, maybe even worse. If we are to ignore or repress individuation, through self-deception or casual dismissiveness for instance, this will force the outside world to arrange situations that are proportionate to our lack of self-knowledge. What is not addressed inside will appear outside. This is all to say that one needs to take into account the unconscious for individuation, self-knowledge, personal development, or whatever you want to call it. This emphasis on the unconscious can be misinterpreted as to say that it denies adaptation in the world. On the contrary, by taking into account what the unconscious is concerned with, dreams can help us in that task. We can now turn to the dream. This time, I've picked a very short dream, so I will approach the interpretation differently. I will first talk about it from the subjective lens, expressing my own feelings and associations. These come from personal notes that I've written when I had the dream. Then I will approach the dream through an objective lens, This will be an example of amplification, which means gathering analogous symbolic motif to elucidate a symbol. I've titled this dream A Goose That Returns to the Feeder, and I had it in March 2021. A group of geese are eating triangle-shaped potato chips. One of the geese stops and comes back loyally to the center, where the man who is throwing the chips is standing. My only association was that potato chips is something that's addictive and unhealthy. And for the personal context, I was reading Jung's essay on sacrifice. You can see the previous video. The interpretation for that dream came quite naturally to me. This is what I wrote in my journal. Beautiful image of the ego self-axis. Describes the attitude that one should have. Yes, there is food outside. It is addictive and unhealthy, but the right attitude is to come back to the center, to the man throwing the chips. The dream indicates that we focus on the food, but forget the feeder. We search for numinosity, but forget its origin. In psychological language, this means that the ego should not lose sight of the self. This reminds me of an Eastern story I read a while ago. I haven't been able to find it again, so it's likely to be incomplete or incorrect. In any case, here is how I remember it. A man travels to a foreign place where something is calling him. Once he arrives, he finds a majestic tree. Behind the tree, a spirit is crying. He asks the spirit, "Why are you crying?" And the spirit says, "Now that you found me, I have to hide again, so you will look for me again." The lesson is that this man was never satisfied, so he had to be tricked into adventures after adventures to somehow find his own company enjoyable. I found this very profound. We can now switch to the objective interpretation. The first symbol is the goose, and like all animals in a dream, you can assume it to be the representation of an instinct. That's what animals are in dream, the representation of instincts. When I do amplification, I first start looking in the collected work of Jung to see if the word goose or geese appeared, and I've not found anything useful. Then I've looked online for something that sparked my interest. The online dream dictionaries are usually not methodical enough or precise enough to be useful. But what I found is a fairy tale called The Goose Girl. Not only that, I found that Ladson Hinton, a Jungian psychoanalyst, had an essay called The Goose Girl, Puella and Transformation. In this essay, he writes this about the goose. All farm people know of the aggressive and territorial nature of geese. They are better watchdogs than watchdogs. Their long phallic necks, goosing, and mythological association with Aphrodite show Eros qualities. Like all swamp birds, they are strongly connected symbolically with the mother rivers and their prolific environs. In some mythologies, the goose is a world creator, layer of the divine egg. In Egypt, geese were connected with spiritual transformation and immortality. The wild goose in its migratory flight is a familiar symbol of intrinsic direction and purpose within nature, of individuation and the transcendent self. All these qualities are contained in the goose, and at this point in the tale, this deep archetypal ground of feminine being has replaced the original, narcissistically dominating mother complex. I conclude that the goose is a representation of an instinct which has the eros quality of focusing on the self, in opposition to an egocentric attitude. Next symbol, the triangle shaped, can be amplified to the Trinity. In Ego and Archetype, Edward Edinger writes, "The Trinity archetype seems to symbolize individuation as a process, while the quaternity symbolizes its goal or completed state. 3 is the number for egohood, 4 is the number for wholeness, the self." Another way to say this is that the process of individuation has a rhythm, and 3 is the number for that rhythm. So 3 is individuation as experienced by the ego, whereas 4 is the goal of individuation, so it's individuation as experienced by the self. Last symbol, the man who is throwing the chips, can be amplified as Christ at the Last Supper giving the bread. This is an image of the self, and it's confirmed by the fact that in the dream the man stands at the center being another image for the self. Focusing on the bread as Eucharist, in the Christian archetypes we read, "These considerations reveal the paradoxical nature of Eucharistic symbolism. On the one hand, the food provides a redeeming connection with the transpersonal self. On the other hand, it is the prima materia which must be transformed and humanized by the efforts of the ego." We now have all the elements for an objective interpretation. The man with throwing chips to the geese is an image of the self, establishing a transpersonal connection with the ego. The triangle-shaped potato chips are the food, the numinous contents that helps to develop the ego. Their addictive and unhealthy nature implies that, like the prima materia, they must be transformed. Finally, the goose that comes back to the center is the eros instinct that comes back to the self. Referring to the Bible, Edinger writes, Paul was aware of the dual nature of the Eucharist when he wrote, "Let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of that bread and drink of that cup. For he that eateth and drinketh unworthily eateth and drinketh damnation to himself, not discerning the Lord's body." This passage is similar in nature to the dream because the triangle-shaped potato chips, which is the food, needs to be eaten by discerning the Lord's body, which is the man throwing the chips at the center. Having done both interpretation, we can now compare them. I'd say the main difference is that the subjective interpretation is guided by feeling, whereas the objective interpretation is guided by thinking. In my case, both are subject to intuition because it's my primary function. The main danger of the subjective interpretation is to lose the ability to compare, contrast, discuss, being contradicted, or perceive outside oneself. This can lead to a solipsistic attitude that is very damaging. In opposition, the danger of the objective interpretation is to lose the feeling of the dream, to lose the personal contact with the living psyche. This can lead to the power motive of intellectual inflation, which tries to explain, understand, and grasp everything. In one of his letters, Jung writes, "In wanting to understand, ethical and human as it sounds, there lurks the devil's will. Understanding is a fearfully binding power at times, a veritable murder of the soul as soon as it flattens out vitally important differences. The core of the individual is a mystery of life, which is snuffed out when it is grasped." Von Franz makes similar remarks to the danger of intellectual interpretation. A merely intellectual interpretation is never satisfactory because the feeling value of the archetypal content is just as important as its understanding. Many investigators have overlooked the feeling tone which is peculiar to each archetypal manifestation. Such a manifestation becomes a mere word or image for them. Those who do not realize the special feeling tone of the archetype, says Jung, end with nothing more than a jumble of mythological concepts which can be strung together to show that everything means anything or nothing at all. In other words, it is impossible to apply the Jungian theory or to carry on effective research in this field if it is separated from its basis in practical psychological experience. These terms gain life and meaning only when you try to take into account their numinosity, i.e., their relation to the living individual. I'll conclude by detailing my practice for what it's worth. I always start with the subjective interpretation, and I gather as many feelings and spontaneous association as I can. Obviously, don't forget the personal context. If you struggle with this part, you can imagine entering the dream as if it was a painting. How does it feel to be in presence of these symbols? In the dream I have used, how does it feel to see the geese eating the chips? How does it feel to see the goose returning back to center? How does it feel to be in presence of this man who is throwing the chips? All those feelings are very useful to guide the interpretation. If no association comes up and feelings are too vague, then amplification is a good tool. It's important to emphasize that a good interpretation must feel right and its emotional content should transform you from within. If you stick with an intellectual interpretation, for instance like, oh yes, this is the self, this is the ego, this is the mother complex, what you've done is you've denied the emotional part of the dream. This means that the content of the dream have not been integrated and the personality has not been transformed. By integration here I refer to the conscious and morally responsible incorporation of the unconscious complexes into the total personality. Von Franz concludes, a dream interpretation, therefore, is only correct when it seems evident to the dreamer, when it stimulates and also evokes an emotional alteration of the personality. So we need two things. We need an understanding that's articulate enough to seem evident to the dreamer, not the analyst, the dreamer, but also this emotional response that transforms the personality. Only if you have both, you have managed a successful dream interpretation. If I had to conclude with anything, I would say never lose the feeling of the dream. If the understanding becomes too intellectual, go back to the emotion of the dream. I hope you enjoyed this slightly different format, and I thank you for your attention. Until next time.